and it includes the county manager, our 2 deputy managers, representation from budget, HR, IT, public information, and goal champions around our 5 goals. We've been talking a lot about how we can try to link our budget with our strategic plan, and really appreciate the opportunity to hear about y'all's model and talk about possibilities. So with that, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. This is John, and you'll probably have to get used to which voice is talking, so we'll try to make sure that we, if you're not quite sure, it really doesn't matter. We're like interchangeable parts. But for Lee, who's met us, I'm the old guy, and Chris is not, so he'll know which ones we are. We just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work that we've been doing probably for about close to the last 4 years. It doesn't seem like it's possible, but we're just excited about the number of communities that continue to reach out to find out more, because I think all of you are on the same path that I've been on for a very long time. And my background is I've been in local government, whether it's cities, counties, school districts, universities. I've been doing this for about 30 years. And this kind of describes my life. And if anybody in there is a veteran of budget and finance for this long, you know that back in the good old days, all we knew was line item budgeting. And I think that every time something new came up in terms of a process, I was always interested in how would it help me do better. I just always believed from the beginning that the budget was intended to be more than just an accounting document. And we laugh that, you know, it's just become the whole process is about putting together that 600-pound budget book that nobody really ever utilizes other than folks like me, because it's got all the information that I need, but I'm not sure it contains the information that everyone needs, nor is it the best tool to communicate sometimes with the organization or with citizens or with our elected officials. And so I followed this path, zero-based budgeting, activity-based costing, all the things that have come out. And several years ago, as people were pursuing the concepts of a more results-based budgeting process, I was really intrigued watching books like The Price of Government, watching the implementation of budgeting for outcomes processes, and really thought this might be the best way for me to figure out how the budget and the organization's strategic plan could really start aligning. I mean, symbolically, even on my bookshelf, that big old budget book sat on one end, and the strategic plan and all the visioning documents sat on the other end, and they didn't touch symbolically, much less did they interact with each other as we were going through the processes. And so that's where, when I met Chris, he had extensive experience working with the city of Fort Collins as they implemented budgeting for outcomes, one of the first organizations in the country to do so. And frankly, he was trying to sell me the work when I was working in Douglas County, Colorado, and I had concerns. And we really built up a strong friendship because we both recognized the concerns of this process. By chance, both of us ended up within 3 weeks of each other, not by our own devices, but really by chance, of working together in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is one of the largest counties in the state. It's immediately to the west of the Denver metro area, right as you're driving up into the mountains. And we were able to spend 3 years in a county environment trying to determine how do we approach what we could see coming on the horizon. This was pre-2007, where we were seeing that things were slowing down. We had no idea how much they would slow down and how much that impact would affect Jefferson County, which had had plenty of money up until that time. And that's where we developed our Fiscal Health and Wellness Initiative, with fiscal health being something that, as the finance guy, I learned that Jefferson County wasn't even on a good, stable foundation of doing good fiscal health practices. They didn't have the foundational elements of good financial management. They were doing some things that were not so good. And so we realized before we could even approach something that in our minds was more of a long-term planning, a long-term sustainability approach like priority-based budgeting, we needed to get our house in order and implement some of the concepts of fiscal health. We're not going to talk much about those concepts today, but certainly if there's an interest or if there's more time where we can spend on those concepts, that's something that we're always happy to do. But I think for today, we really want to focus on our long-term wellness initiative, which is the process of priority-based budgeting.
As we've been presenting this work and helping organizations implement it across the country over the last number of years, one of the things that has been so interesting is how various organizations, how different county managers have perceived the work. What is this all about? What is it that we're actually doing? And one of the city managers from a community in California, Fairfield, the city of Fairfield, he was looking back on their work with us and said, you know, it's literally as if the times right now are so different from what we've known. They're so stressful. We don't have a roadmap for what we're going through, and we don't know what's coming next. It's as if our sight is blurred. The old ways, our old tried and true practices aren't working because our perspective of the world is just like that chart on the left-hand side. And what priority-based budgeting has brought to his organization is a clearer way to see things. Different questions have been emerging, and we see this again and again in the work, and that's what's making us so excited. It's as if priority-based budgeting is a new tool that you can present upon your organization, and new questions are arising. How do you look for partnerships? How do we look for the right programs to have shared services? It's through this new lens that we've been able to see our way to answering those questions more clearly. We did want you to see the number of organizations and the types of organizations who have implemented this over the last few years. Those numbers in parentheses represent the years that various organizations have continued to sustain the process. It's been one of our main objectives, is to develop something that is long-lasting, that can sustain in an organization. It's not that you go through this process once and then it's over and you return to the old way of doing business. But you also see there are large counties, there are smaller organizations, everywhere in between. And as John said, which is so important, we come from a county environment. That's really where we learn to implement this. So knowing full well the challenges that you're up against with various elected officials and elected offices and how you go through the budget process, that's been one of the things that we're so proud of, is the applicability in a county environment to do the work. I think through the work that Lee certainly has been involved with, you know that ICMA created the Center for Management Strategies as a partnership with the Alliance for Innovation to actually take a step up in this new environment and say, can we start to identify emerging innovative practices, things that appear to have merit and we should study. And then through ICMA's Center for Management Strategies, their work really analyzing, are these results repeatable? Are these processes scalable? Do they work in organizations large and small, county and city? And then developing what they have deemed the leading practices. And it was just last year where fiscal health and wellness through priority-based budgeting, the work that we're into and that we're about to present, was recognized as one of the first 2 leading practices from ICMA Center for Management Strategies. So we know how deeply you care about the profession of professional management and local government, and as we do too, we've been so appreciative of the work that ICMA has done to help us spread the message of this work. So let's get into this a little bit. John mentioned that when we worked together in Jefferson County, it was back earlier than 2007, and we actually needed a way to present to our own board of county commissioners just what priority-based budgeting was all about. So we took a newspaper article from a California newspaper, and you see that it's from 2007, and this was when the state was going through a $14.5 billion cutback. They had a shortfall, and the governor's office decided the best way to go through this to balance the budget was to apply an across-the-board budget cut. And you see in the quote, the across-the-board approach spreads the reductions out as evenly as possible so that no single program gets singled out. That's why we do across-the-board budget cutting, because for lack of any other strategy, it's difficult to show favoritism, and it's difficult to pick on certain programs, and obviously programs that all have a constituency. Well, the reaction we found most interesting, that the governor's approach would be like a family deciding to cut its monthly mortgage payment, the dining out tab, and the Netflix subscription, each by that same 10% across the board amount, rather than eliminating the restaurant and DVD spending in order to keep up the house payments. Of course, that's what we would do in our own households, but how do we do this in the local government environment that we're in? How do we actually identify what are the mortgage payment services that we provide and differentiate them from things that are more of the Netflix subscription programs? Furthermore, how do we gain consensus on this from our citizens, from our various departments, and from our elected officials that indeed we have differentiated these programs appropriately? That's what our process has been all about. This is how we started it, and a bit of philosophy.
And we've also observed that the rating agencies in the last few years have really had a difficult time because of, especially in California, where things haven't gone so well with local governments. And there's been a real concern because people are defaulting on their bonds and they're declaring bankruptcy. And so the rating agencies have had to pay much more attention than ever before on how local governments are managing the long term. How are they dealing with their fiscal sustainability over time? And they've come out pretty strongly saying that that across-the-board approach in many ways is kind of the coward's way out. It avoids the tough choices and the tough decisions, and it really doesn't help sustain the organization for the long term. In the days where it was more like a roller coaster, we just kind of went up and down, and across-the-board budget cuts kind of helped us bridge the small little gap, but then we went back to the way things were. That was one thing, but now we're really having to permanently change the way we do business. And so the rating agencies are very concerned that if we continue to approach it the way we always have, we're really not going to be looking to the long term. And so they're talking about a process, and I think it's exactly what we're all talking about here, that we'll find out what's important to the community, what are the community values, and that they're being more strategic about how their resources are being allocated, and much more strategic, especially in downtimes, of how those resources are reduced so that they're not impacting the needs and desires of the community. And so we've seen, even in evidence of the work, Chesapeake, Virginia, Douglas County, Nevada, both implementers of priority-based budgeting have actually been given they've retained their bond rating, or they've seen an increase in their bond rating simply because they can demonstrate long-term financial planning, strategic planning, a look towards the future, and it's been stated in their letters from the rating agencies, priority-based budgeting. Boone County, Illinois, actually, because of their work just in fiscal health, was able to attain a higher bond rating because they could see demonstrate clearly that they were focused on the long term and their sustainability. I put this quote in here just because for me, as a 30-year person that's really dedicated my life to spending in local government, I think that this is also the final indication of why an across-the-board approach doesn't work for the long term, because it really might spread the pain equally, but I think it provides an excuse for us to become mediocre. We're still going to do everything we did, but we can't do it as well. And our goal in local government is always to excel, to provide the best possible services. But maybe in this day and age, we have to be more strategic about what that looks like and make sure that those resources are being dedicated to what we're in business to do, rather than just everything that we can think of we could spend our money on to offer programs and services to our constituents.
So for the next part of this presentation, we really want to get into methodology, so you can hear more about how the process actually works. And as we go through this, you're going to want to think about the work that you've already been through in some of your strategic planning. Start to imagine, if you will, and we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about it, where you have bits and pieces of this process that you will be able to leverage to pull it all together. We're always looking for that opportunity to build on what you've already been doing, rather than have the process appear to be something completely new. We're going to walk through these 5 steps, from determining what are the results we're trying to achieve and how do we define them to gain a little more clarity. Step 3, how do we identify the programs and services we offer, and then evaluate those programs based on how they achieve the results you're trying to accomplish, in addition to some other criteria that we'll get into. And then lastly, we're going to demonstrate for you the tool that pulls all of this together and has really been the catalyst for this idea of a new lens.
One of the things that Chris and I really emphasize in the work is that this process isn't about necessarily spitting out the answers and you just follow a formula and a pattern. It's more about engaging the organization in more strategic questions and more strategic conversations. And so we approach this by saying, what are the questions we should be asking? And when you're trying to do something that follows your strategic plan, even in the budget, the first question shouldn't be, how much do we need? How much do you need to plan for in the budget? But it needs to step back and say, what are we really in business to do? What is it that we were created to provide for our communities? What is it that's most important for us, that we're starting all of our conversations, whether it's budgeting or anything else, with the first question in mind? Let's always focus on what we're in business to do, our goals, objectives, but as we like to call them, results. And results in our mind sometimes are a little different than what we might find in an organization's strategic plan. Because many times, especially when we're engaging our elected officials, we're focusing on the checklist of things that we need to accomplish in the next few budget cycles, or the promises that the elected officials made that they want to accomplish. So it becomes a checklist that at a certain point in time, we hope we can take that goal off the checklist. We step back to a higher level. We don't want to establish a checklist of things we accomplish and then we're done with them. We want to establish a list of the things that we continually measure ourselves against and try to provide services so we're consistently, over time, achieving these results, that they're the measure against which we're always talking in terms of why we exist. And we want to make sure that we're not focusing just on the things that are broken, the things that need more attention, but everything that we do so that we can comprehensively articulate to our constituencies, to our organization, here are the things that matter to us. Here are the results we're trying to accomplish, and we want to use this as the basis to determine what are we doing that's important to us. If it doesn't measure up against our results, we should be asking, why are we doing this? We also want to make sure these results aren't just something that are an easy thing to say. We laugh. Some communities say, well, we want to have people smile all day long. Well, that's a nice thing to put in your marketing brochure. It's a nice thing about the atmosphere that you want to create, but it's not getting down to the reasons we offer programs. Unless we offer dental services, I'm not sure that making people smile all day is going to be something we want to say is objective. We want to be clear. These are the reasons we exist. They probably don't change much over time. They probably stay pretty consistent for our organization. But as Chris often likes to say, we want to find out if we stop doing things tomorrow, if we shut down government, would anybody notice? And we laugh because we think, well, we hope they would. And our question is, why would they? What is it that they are expecting? What is it that they want from you? What would they desperately miss that we provided them in your community? And so that's where our first step really focuses on determining the results. And we like to start with organizations where they've done some work in strategic planning, where they've identified perhaps those 5, 6, 7 long-term, high-level goals that we can begin with. Now, many times we'll work with the organization to maybe rephrase them a bit, tweak them a bit. Sometimes they may be a little too much. There may be more than one concept rolled up into it. We find that a very strong goal like quality of life has many times so many components that it's worth splitting that out so that we can clearly articulate there are several key major components that are rolled up in something that's really large, like quality of life. The example of the slide is the work we did with Grand Island, Nebraska, that we took their strategic plan and we could clearly see, based on the work and based on our conversations, there were 4 things that they believed defined why they existed as a local government: stewardship of the environment, safe community, strategic, sustainable, and maintained development, and mobility options. If they kept their eye focused on accomplishing these things and making sure that they were always meeting those results, they would be complete in the eyes of the community. We know that sometimes we talk about efficiency and transparency. Those are great things that we have to articulate to our community, but are they really differentiators? Everything we do needs to be measured against transparency and efficiency. So it's not about making that a reason we offer programs, That's a value set. That's a way we offer the programs. And no matter where we end up in this process, every program that's a high priority has to accomplish these areas. So we'll state them, but they're not really used in the evaluation process. Finally, one of the areas of concern for me as the finance director, when I studied budgeting for outcomes, when I learned more about it from Chris, when I saw the turmoil that occurred in Fort Collins, Colorado, I realized one of the big problems was there was no place to truly evaluate the programs that we offer internally to support the organization, our governance functions as we call them. Now, I really believe as finance director that I did things that were critical to keeping the organization running, that were essential, that were a high priority. But if I was trying to determine how does payroll meet mobility options or stewardship of the environment, I soon thought that everything that finance, HR, fleet, facilities, IT would accomplish would not score very well. They would fall to the bottom, and then guess what? What I heard in so many staff meetings over the years, well, if we just cut all that overhead, we could balance our budget. I don't think of myself as overhead. I think I do some very important things. But I also realized in the county environment, I couldn't let everybody know, including the other elected officials like the sheriff and the clerk and recorder, that finance, HR, IT, fleet, facilities, purchasing are not going to participate in this process because these aren't our results. We wouldn't have gotten very far in implementation of priority-based budgeting. And so for us, it's important to also establish what we call the governance results, the things that articulate clearly why we offer programs and services internally to support the organization. And we think that fairly, this evaluation criteria will help us determine what are the mortgage payments of our governance programs and the things that are of a lesser priority, just like we're identifying the highly important community-based programs, those we offer externally, against the results that we want to achieve. And so you'll be imagining this process taking a parallel path in the evaluation of community programs evaluating against community results and governance programs, those internally focused functions, evaluating themselves against governance results. But for Chris and I, as we started really looking at things like safe community and mobility options, we realized that these were still rather large concepts. This slide represents the 5 goals results that the city of Boulder, Colorado was really interested in. You can see there's some similarities: safe community, healthy environment, economically vital. Now, inclusive and socially thriving community, that's Boulder. If anybody of you have been to Boulder, you know that's highly important to them. Not every community values that as a reason that they exist, but in Boulder, it truly is a reason that their local government functions. And so for us, we looked at these and said, boy, there's still a lot of room for subjectivity when you talk about something like a safe community. How do we get more articulate about what that means in our community? 95% of the organizations that have implemented priority-based budgeting say they want to have a safe community. But as we've gone through the work, we find out that that looks completely different in Cincinnati, Ohio, than it does in Grand Island, Nebraska, or Temple City, California. They're very, very different. And so the next part of the process is to really take those high-level results and create definitions around them so that we're clear on how does success look in our organization. These are where we get more directly involved in defining the needs of our particular community. No one organization's result map will look the same. They will be different. There will be some similarities. There will be places where you can see a direct connection, but they'll all take on a different presence. They'll have different things. Here in Grand Island, stewardship of the environment, a big concept. You can see by just going around the result map that there are multiple ways that they really think about that, whether it's air and water quality that you see in the first component of the circle, manage and mitigates factors that impact environmental quality and sustainability, heavy industry that's not very compliant that they need to help, which is where they're encouraging energy conservation and efficiency with education and provision of alternative solutions. The last one, controls and abates threats to the environment caused by nature. You think, wonder what this is about. Very quickly, it was about the fact that as we were going through the exercise of deterring it, many people offered the response, what's a problem? What are we trying to accomplish? And they said, starlings. Well, we found out that this wasn't about habitat species preservation. As the mayor told Chris very bluntly, no, we've got to kill those damn birds. And it was because they were causing an environmental problem. They swoop in and they really wreak havoc on the whole community. And so for them, they had to be able to express that the programs that they dealt with to rid themselves of this starling plague were important to the stewardship of the environment. Here's just an example of Chandler, Arizona, their safe community. And you can see that it does talk a lot about the things that we normally associate with a safe community: prevention, law enforcement, fire protection, EMS services. But you can see clearly they also aren't limiting this to public safety organizations. They're talking about all the ways in which their community is safe. And this includes our transportation systems. We've got to have safe roads, safe traffic flow. In their case, they had a lot of instances where they needed to engage youth and families in productive activities because they were starting to see the influence of latchkey kids, gangs, and people that didn't have something to do and they were getting themselves into trouble, as well as some things about dilapidated buildings, code enforcement, the safety of our structures. And so for them, this more clearly explained a safe community than what we typically might see in just police, fire, and EMS. Wheat Ridge, Colorado, the same result, but a different result map. Some similarities, but some things on here that are a little bit more important. For them, stormwater management, air and water quality were as much about the safety of the community as they were about the environmental sustainability of the community. So I think you can see from this, these result maps become the unique way to express what a result means for us in our particular community. This just represents example of the governance map, and as we talked about earlier, these would be the results against which our internally focused programs would be able to evaluate themselves so that we could understand what are the things we're doing to support the internal structure of our organization that are highly important, and what are the things that perhaps are less important and we should have conversations about. The second question we really feel is important, once we have established clearly what we're in business to do, what's our strategic vision of what lies ahead, is what is it that we do? And for so many organizations, they have the conversation of the budget, especially when they're trying to prioritize, especially when they have to make reduction decisions. What's more important, police or parks? Public works or libraries? And I guess what happens is, we know what the answer always turns out to be. One is discretionary, the other is core. Well, we don't think that we should continue the conversation at the department level. There is no one department that is core and others that are discretionary. In our work, we believe all departments offer things or should offer things that are critical to our results, that the community expects. And so we want to be clear, we're not going to favor one department or another. We're going to work with an organization to establish a program inventory, a list of all the programs and services that are offered so that we can more fairly evaluate what we do against each program. Outside of the department or elected office silo, we compare all the programs one against another so that we can determine which are the programs that are most important, most highly relevant to achieving our results, and what are the programs that perhaps relative to other things that we do are not quite as important. And so this evaluation is to take everything we do. Now, sometimes we're surprised when we find out we do a lot of stuff. We offer a lot of programs and services. One of the counties that we're working with right now, Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, when they got through this work, they identified over 1,200 programs. And trust me, these weren't really minute detail in the weeds programs. These were all major functions because they offered a lot of things, including nursing home care. They offered assisted living care. They offered about every kind of service I could think of that a local government might possibly dip into. And again, some that I was wondering, why are you doing these things? But it's their county structure. I think it won't be surprising when we work with organizations to find out that at a minimum, we do 300 to 400 different things. And this is a way we can start articulating clearly to our community which I believe is the true answer to transparency. What do we do, and how much does it cost us to do it? And that's where this step in the process is to help each department identify what they do at a program level and what are the resources, whether it's the budget resources or the staff equivalency that they allocate to these resources, so we can have better discussions about what's most important to us and what's less important to us.
So we move into the next question, and in your minds you can picture at this point in the process you will have results, both community results and the governance results. Those results will be defined using the result mapping process, and you'll have a program inventory representing everything that you offer across the entire county. So at this point we move into the evaluation phase. How are we going to understand and begin to differentiate the programs that we offer? Which ones are most relevant, those mortgage payment services, as differentiated from the Netflix if we have to. And as you look at this slide right now, keeping the story consistent with the city of Boulder, you see on the left-hand side, the results that you're trying to accomplish will make up the primary evaluation criteria. It makes sense, right? The degree to which your program of yours really achieves results, that means it's more relevant as compared to a program that has less to do with results. That's the basic logic of our scoring process. But you see on the right-hand side, as John and I were developing this work, and especially within the county environment, we realized that results alone could not account for all the reasons why we provide programs. What if the program's mandated? How do we take that into consideration? What if citizens truly rely on us as a service provider, and if we stop doing the program, there's nobody else for the citizens to turn to? So that's where we get into that reliance factor. How about programs that pay for themselves, be it through grants or a fee or a charge, as distinct from programs that depend on general government revenues? How do we take all of these considerations into the process of evaluating programs? And we realized we needed to create this series of attributes, additional scoring criteria, and these are very flexible. As you get into the work, you probably will use attributes such as these, but this is where we also see in communities that they might have other evaluation criteria to take into effect. Now, as we go through scoring, it's a very simple process. John and I cannot emphasize this enough. One of the downfalls of budgeting for outcomes is that it was overwhelming for the city of Fort Collins to go through. So overwhelming, in fact, that they went to 2-year budgets because it was just bogging down that organization. As John and I were in Jefferson County, not only did we not have many staff to depend on, so we needed it to be something that we could actually implement, but we were very sensitive to this fact that we needed a process that was easy to go through, easy to implement, and easy because we had all of this other work to do. So as we got into program scoring, we wanted the process to be very straightforward, and that's what you see here on the screen. The scoring scale, as programs are scored relative to results, is a basic 0 to 4, and same with the basic program attributes. Against results, we're trying to understand, does the program have a high degree of impact on achieving the result, as differentiated from programs that have something to do with achieving the result, but just not a high impact, as distinct from programs that just don't have any influence whatsoever. So by using that 0 to 4, it keeps it very simple to communicate how that program is influencing the results against its evaluated. Here on the basic program attribute side, we also apply this 0 to 4 scoring scale. And so here as an example, and we're going to refer to this as we demonstrate the model at the end, consider mandates. So often, as soon as you hear that a program is mandated, it's off the table for discussion. It's mandated, it's automatically assumed it's our highest priority. Here we ask the question, well, how mandated is it? There are strong forms of mandate, those that come from a higher form of government that are tough to change and that you're truly required to do, versus other mandates that Pam Muse from the Alliance for Innovation called the self-imposed mandates, those that are required by our own codes and ordinances and resolutions. So we have a scoring scale to differentiate how mandated a program actually is. Similarly, on the reliance side, just as an example, we distinguish between programs that citizens truly rely on you to receive this particular service versus the other end of the spectrum. There are other service providers. Maybe they come from the public sector, maybe they come from the private sector, and we have to know this information. We're going to glean this as we go through the work. So those are just two examples of going through the scoring process and using those basic program attributes. As scoring takes place, there are two phases to it. The first is a self-assessment. The next is a quality control or peer review step. And we just want to demonstrate this for you. As departments go through and score their programs, they get a scorecard. And you see here, this is an example from San Jose. All of their programs in the inventory of that department are listed, and they go through each of those basic program attributes, and they go through each of the result areas, scoring their programs against every single one of the categories. Another primary distinction between this process and other results-based budgeting processes is that in some other processes, the attempt is to try and find out the result that the program meets best. So if you're in patrol, you try to align yourself with achieving a safe community. And that ignores all of the other results that you're trying to accomplish. In our work, and it was actually in the city of Boulder where their business community really rallied behind this process, they recognized that something different is occurring when we score a program against every single one of the results that we're trying to accomplish. And that is this idea of return on investment, or leveraging the resources that were being used, because a program that achieves not one result, but 2 results or 3 results is like a tax dollar being spent once, twice, or 3 times to achieve result after result after result. That's what we're trying to get after. Now, the other key component to this is we've talked about the self-assessment. Departments score their own programs first, and that's key. If you want buy-in into this process, giving departments that first chance to demonstrate the impact that their programs have will gain you their buy-in and support as you move forward towards the end of this process. Now, there's a second component of this process, and it's the peer review stage, where we've designed it, and we'll get into far more detail as you actually consider moving through this. But the way peer review works is that there's a team set up around each one of your result areas, as well as your basic program attributes. The makeup of each team is designed intentionally so that nobody's ever really put in a place where they're evaluating their own programs. So we want people with the least vested interest to see their programs do well serve on a peer review team, so we truly get that jury of your peers situation. Now, one of the things we talked about with Lee is part of the county's desire to really bring to the forefront the idea of how do we measure that a program is actually achieving a result or not? How do we know? What's the evidence that we have? We found again and again through this component of the process here in peer review, when we have teams that are questioning, why do we think this program actually has an impact on the result that we're reviewing? This is where performance measures for the very first time have direct context, because we're asking the question specifically, what evidence, whether it's quantitative or even qualitative, do we have that this program actually has a high degree of influence on the results that we're reviewing? So that's the idea behind peer review. And again, we can get into far more discussion about that, but this is where performance measures really come into play. But coming out of peer review, every program ends up with a final score. And we're moving towards the end of the process here. And you can see this is an example from the city of Boulder. And each one of these little lines represents one of the programs that they offer, and its final score is indicated from left to right. So you see there's a group of programs that scored really highly. Those are your quartile 1 programs. They have the highest degree of impact on the results that you're trying to achieve. They're differentiated from this next group of programs, which you see here, called quartile 2. Quartile 2 are also very highly relevant programs. They scored well in the process. They're distinct from quartile 3, and ultimately you see quartile 4 programs scoring fairly low in the process, at least relative to the results that the city of Boulder is trying to achieve. Now, as we develop quartiles, it's not like taking the top 25% and calling those quartile 1 and the next 25% and calling those quartile 2. It's more like grading a set of test scores on a curve. That's the easiest way to describe it. There's some analysis and statistics that go into this process to understand the meaningful difference between quartile 1 programs and quartile 2, 3, and 4. But we're not so concerned with the individual rankings of the programs. Instead, these groupings give us an understanding across the entire county of your most relevant, your mortgage payment services versus the Netflix that we offer. And finally, as we attach the program costs to each of these programs, you can see here in Boulder, for the very first time, we're going to have an understanding overall across the organization of how your resources are being allocated and where your opportunities are to consider resource reallocation. So here in Boulder, as they first developed the model, you see here they're spending $85.9 million in quartile 1, $51 million in quartile 2, $21.5 million in quartile 3, and $7.5 million in quartile 4. This was a healthier rate. The majority of their resources are going towards those quartile 1 and quartile 2 programs, but it opens up now a new window, a new way to start asking questions. What does it mean to have $21.5 million in quartile 3? How about $7.5 million in quartile 4? And how do we dig into this to start to ask different questions about these programs that we've just been evaluating throughout the process? So it's at this point that we actually want to demonstrate for you how the tool comes together, give you a brief orientation about how the model actually works, and then dive into the types of questions that we're able to ask as we start to put the tool in use.
We thought that this tool was important because, like with everything else, again, it's a tool. It's a way to engage the organization in some meaningful conversations, but not just based on one visual or one viewpoint, but we want to be able to walk around the budget almost in a three-dimensional way, to see the budget from different perspectives, and to be able to focus on not only some resource allocation decisions, but help our elected officials focus on the policy choices that they might need to make. And so Chris is going to walk you through kind of the functionality of the tool, how it works, and then we're going to talk a little bit more of the enhancements that have been developed over the last few years that really let you even further isolate some specific instances so you can focus on some very specific policy discussions.
So you remember that John talked about the distinction. We have community-oriented programs, and that's what we're looking at right here. But we can also look at the governance programs. And down here, here's a key metric. We're now down to 16% of the budget, but the tool automatically scales. Now, here's what's really fascinating. So we're looking at the City of Boulder's governance programs, and we know that sometimes when you go through a prioritization process that whether it's our elected officials or even our administration, there can sometimes be an inherent assumption that programs that we offer directly to citizens have to be a higher priority than our internal functions. And that was the substance behind John's joke about the overhead. But here we see something entirely different. Look at the quartile 1 and the quartile 2 array for these governance programs. That's saying that even within governance, we have programs that are absolutely imperative and highly relevant for us to offer. Of course, we have quartile 3 and quartile 4 programs to take a look at. But quartile 1 and quartile 2, without these programs, we're probably not even running the government effectively, and our programs that we're offering directly to citizens will be less effective. Now, we can put these two pictures together and look at all programs across the entire city in Boulder. As we move on to this next filter, we know that we absolutely have to still budget at the accounting fund level. So if we needed to just isolate the general fund, we could. And here we're only looking at the general fund resources and how they're tied to the programs still within this framework of the quartile system. Now, you might be asking, well, why wouldn't we only use the general fund, and why bother involving any of our other funds? And I'll show you really quickly, and this will have resonance to you all as well for all of the different kinds of funds that you have within the county. Here's the Water Enterprise Fund, the utility for the City of Boulder, and you notice a high degree of spending in quartile 2 and some in quartile 1, highly relevant programs. This is a good array, but they also have quartile 3 and quartile 4 spending going on within this fund. So before they automatically go out and ask for a rate increase for the water fund, they're investigating opportunities that they have here in quartile 3 and quartile 4. Maybe they can cut back some of the spending there and reallocate those resources to stave off a rate increase. I'll go back to the overall citywide picture. As we move on to this third filter, while we've emphasized the importance of getting to that program level and not comparing one department against another, we can still roll up the programs to make this a highly useful tool for the departments themselves. So really quickly, everybody always wants to see how does the police department do in this process. And I'm sure you're all guessing that they would have had only quartile 4 programs. No, just kidding. You can see here the police department did phenomenal. So many of their programs, quartile 1 and quartile 2. Why is that? That's because those programs had a high degree of impact on Boulder's safe city result, on their inclusive and socially thriving, on their transportation-oriented result. Those programs ended up in quartile 1 and quartile 2 because they demonstrated a high degree of influence on those results. What do you also see, however, and so surprising, even within the police department, they have quartile 3 and quartile 4 programs. Now, you might be asking, well, I bet the police chief didn't buy into this. Well, he absolutely did, and John and I asked him about it. He said, through that process of self-scoring, our self-assessment, we were in charge of scoring our programs. We're not surprised by this. We're happy to see that so much of what we offer is of the highest priority, but we absolutely recognize that we have programs that aren't 100% attached to results. And then really quickly, because it helps us demonstrate this final filter, here's the Parks and Rec department in the City of Boulder, and so many of the programs in Parks and Recreation actually charged for the services that they provided. There was fees at the rec center or for particular classes and training sessions. And this last filter, which is going to be very crucial for you all in county government as well, allows us to make sure that we understand that some programs bring in program-specific revenues, which means that they're meant to pay specifically for a particular program. And we don't want to confuse the issue that if we stop providing that program, that we continue to collect those fees and charges. No, those program revenues would go away as well, so we'd be down to the general government resources, which we truly have the opportunity to talk about resource reallocation. So we can toggle between those various ways that programs are funded as well.
I know we've got just a really brief amount of time left, but we want to show you again some additional functionality that I think is highly important for any organization. Remember, we captured a lot of information in the scoring process about results, but also about those attributes. And so the model allows you to go in and ask specific questions based on the attribute scores, because as you remember from that example, those had a specific meaning. So let's ask the question, what is it we do that is mandated by a higher level of government that that's being imposed on us? So if we use the scoring criteria, any program that scored itself equal to 4 means that it, in Boulder's case, was something mandated by the federal, state, or county government. As you look at this picture, well, it's fascinating that for once we're able to come up with a dollar figure about what our mandates are, and for any view, we can generate a list of those programs. What are the things that we do that are mandated? And that's one of the beauties of this. As you're going through this, you don't have to say, now I've got to go back and try to figure out what those programs are. The model will show them to you. But what you see is that most of these programs that are mandated are also in quartile 1 and 2. You can't get into quartile 1 and 2 just by being mandated alone. You also have to demonstrate a close connection to many of the results that are important to the community. So it changes the entire discussion about mandates, because most likely we would be doing most of these things anyway, because they're helping us accomplish the results that are important to our community. Now, as you can also notice, there are quartile 3 and 4 programs. Well, in many budget discussions, all you have to do is play the mandate card, and that program no longer gets any attention and is off the table for any further discussion. We believe that even for those programs that are mandated but demonstrate little or nothing to do with our results, we absolutely need to have further conversations. We need to determine, are we perhaps over-offering these services? What's exactly the level of service demanded by the mandate? We can go in and check and make sure that we're not doing more than that mandate requires. Why would we spend more money on something that's not relevant to us? We'll spend the minimum amount. Example, in a county government, clerk and recorder in Jefferson County had to issue license plates. That's all the mandate said, issue license plates. It did not say with a wait time of 5 minutes or less in 7 convenient locations across the county. This program was not relevant to our results. And so instead of continuing to expand the number of license bureaus and to insist on staffing so that people could walk in, get their license plate, and walk out in 5 minutes, we started exploring other alternatives where we weren't devoting the same number of resources. Some elected officials are even asking the question, well, what's the penalty for not meeting the mandate? If that cost is less than actually delivering on the mandate, maybe we should accept the penalty and move on. So again, there is no right or wrong answer. It's not formulaic. You don't cut quartile 4 automatically, but you certainly have the conversations. Now, what if you wanted to look more specifically at programs, and we can couple these filters? So let's look at programs that are not mandated by anyone else other than perhaps ourselves. We've self-imposed the mandate, it's a best practice, or there's nothing in writing requiring us to do the program. And we turn on a second filter, the reliance filter, as you remember from our example, where these are programs that are also offered by another public or private sector organization. So now you've got the combination of 2 of the filters. Plus, let's take out those programs that we charge a fee for. So let's just look at programs that are only supported by tax dollars. And here is a view of our budget based on programs that are mandated only by ourselves. We've imposed the mandate in our code or in a policy that there are other public or private sector organizations that offer it. We're not collecting any revenues. And if you focus on quartile 3 and 4, these programs aren't helping us achieve the results. Even in good times, wouldn't you study these programs? Why are we spending money here? If a private sector business is offering something similar, well, at least shouldn't we discuss charging a fee? They certainly are. What about partnership opportunities? What about just saying this may not be what we're in business to do? What about those things that we've self-imposed, but they're not relevant to us anymore because that policy, that code, that ordinance, that resolution was passed in 1967. It's not relevant. Let's study it, and maybe we can lift that self-imposed mandate because it's time to. It's no longer relevant to the circumstances. I think you can see that as we've just gone through this one picture, we can ask multiple questions that are relevant and that we can engage our policymakers in. What we want to demonstrate is that this gives you the ability, as we call it, to slice and dice your budget, to ask different questions from different perspectives that will perhaps lead you to better conversations about how resources could be allocated in the county.
We're going to turn it back over to you, Michael and Lee. And just as we do, we wanted to leave you with the types of questions that organizations and their elected officials are able to get to in this new way. Which programs are of the highest priority in terms of achieving what is expected of your community, to be able to actually answer that, and which programs are, if we had to differentiate relative to everything that we do, of lesser importance.
And I would just emphasize, as the finance guy, the budget guy, I love my 600-pound budget book. It has a role, it has a need, it's a tool. But looking at these questions, can we use that document to answer these questions? We believe that this is a process that supplements the great work that we put into the budget document itself, but can be even a better way to engage elected officials and our organization and perhaps our citizens into more meaningful conversations that aren't strictly about numbers, that aren't strictly about ratios, but are more about the policy questions we're trying to establish and really help focus their attention on the fact that we are allocating their resources, that what they contribute to support our organization towards the things that are entirely important to them.
So Lee, we'll turn it back over to you and Michael, and we'd be happy to talk about any questions you have about the process or some of the thoughts that you have at this point.
Thank you all. You gave us a lot to chew on, and I should have mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we've also got our entire budget staff that's here this week listening in and chewing on it too. So I just want to open it up to the group and see what questions you all have of John and Chris.
Do you have any examples of those internal service divisions and how they came out in this whole process?
We'll go back to the model, and basically those are part of what we would have in that governance focus. Those would include the internal services, I'm assuming like fleet, facilities, mailroom. Those types of things would be part of this governance picture, while it also includes finance, HR, things that we don't necessarily always treat as internal service funds. The concept is the same. They're programs and services that we offer to support the internal structure. So regardless of how we account for them, whether through internal service funds or whether through a cost allocation methodology or whether they simply get charged to the general fund, those programs are all evaluated against the governance results as well, so that we can determine what are the things of highest priority. When we did this in Jefferson County, we had many internal service functions, including facilities, fleet, risk management, IT. And we were able then to look at those functions through this filter and start looking at the things that we were offering in those internal functions that weren't as relevant to the results that our organization wanted. And so it was a way for those internal functions to start having the discussion about how they could perhaps cut back on some of the things that they offered that were being charged to the departments that weren't really relevant to the department's needs anymore.
As John described early on, this difficulty that we have understanding, well, what is it that we do internally and how do we evaluate these programs fairly? That's just been a key to this work, because up until now there really hasn't been clearly established criteria. Why do we offer these internal programs? So to see that conversation change, especially as we on the staff side are talking with elected officials, that it's not just that our internal functions are overhead, it's not just that they're customer support either. I mean, that's an element of why we offer them, is to support the departments. But that the reasons for existence are to improve the way we make decisions, to improve analysis, to handle the regulatory and mandated requirements that we have across the board. What we're able to get to in that governance result map, and then, you know, as you see here in this vision of the tool in Boulder, that so many of these programs are just as highly relevant as programs that we offer in police or in your sheriff's department. That's been a real key breakthrough for us on the internal side.
Any other questions? I know y'all got them.
This is Keith Lane from the budget office. I know this was a fairly short presentation, but there was not much talked about the measurement side of this. As I'm looking at the system right now, I mean, this is one way of helping you allocate resources, but it has, so far from what I've seen, it doesn't deal a lot with efficiencies. In other words, you might have your entire budget in quarter number 1, and it's extraordinarily important, but that doesn't answer the question, as I've seen right now, if you're doing those things as well as you could be. In other words, efficiently. If dollars are tightening up, as they are, and you've moved everything out of quarter 3 and 4 that you could, in theory, it still doesn't answer the question, are you using the dollars you are putting in quarter 1 as efficiently as you could? And that's a major function in a world where budgets are tightening up and you're allocating dollars. It's not simply just moving dollars around. That's part of it. And that's a lot of what you guys are focused on here. But how do you incorporate into that any knowledge of how efficiently you're using the dollars, irrespective of the quarter you find it in?
Very good. Keith, great point. And you said it exactly how we would say it. Once we start to understand our opportunities for moving dollars out of quartile 4, quartile 3, how do we ensure that programs, even highly costly programs in quartile 1, are doing their jobs as efficiently as possible? How do we break into that? You stated it exactly how we want to answer the question. And our belief as we develop this process is that we have to tackle the question of relevance first, and then dive right into that efficiency question about resource utilization. When we first went through this process in Jefferson County, there's a funny story for you. One of the lower ranked programs that just had no tie to results whatsoever came out of a 4-H kind of a program, and it was citizens of Jefferson County, which, you know, this is a fairly urban area with some unincorporated as well, could bring in their sick tomato plants to the county and get some advice about why they were failing in their gardening work. And if you talk to the constituents of that particular program, they loved it. It was very favorable. They did citizen surveys, and they had some reports to demonstrate to us that citizens really considered this one of the most highly sought after programs they could ever imagine. Through the roof, this program was believed to be an efficient program and highly exceptional. However, when we tackle the question of relevance first, what we found is that it's quartile 4. It just doesn't help us achieve what we want. Before we start automatically studying the efficiency of that program, we wanted to tackle a different question. We wanted to say, why are we even in this business whatsoever? We don't want to make it more efficient. We want to actually stop providing this particular service. However, on the other side of the equation, again, our very first year in Jefferson County, we had snow removal, which for us in Colorado, you guys might not have it this way, but in Colorado, snow removal is a program that was achieving many of our various results. Within our road and bridge department, who offered snow removal, they put it to the test. Well, maybe we can, for our first year, hang on to some of our programs, even our lower priority programs, if we can tackle an efficiency in snow removal. And that was a quartile 1 program that they reduced 30% because they went about it a different way, trying to reduce the overtime, some of the contracted work that was going on with the snow removal. But you're exactly right. We have to tackle relevance first, demonstrate that we can not ask questions about efficiency for every single program, especially the low priority programs, but then concentrate efficiency discussions on the higher priority.
And I think it helps us focus the department's attention on where will that efficiency study, where will the questions about how we utilize resources be most effective. For many times, the departments are said, go find efficiencies. And they just kind of do a shotgun scatter effect where they'll just study anything. First of all, we don't want them to study the things that are low relevance. Second of all, we don't really need them to study some of the things that are really not a significant dollar amount first. Our intention is that as this process iterates over time, that every program will undergo some kind of a discussion. But what's the right discussion for that program? And we think that this will lead us to the first year tackling those programs in quartile 1 and 2 that are costing us the most. And we can focus our efficiency attention strictly on those first, because we'll get the best bang for the buck in the study. We'll be able to focus the right attention. And so it gives us the way to now tell the departments, now here are the programs right now we want you to study for efficiency. But we can help them with that. So it's, again, not a scatter or a shotgun approach. It's directly targeted against the things that are highly important to us, but yet are also utilizing the most resources. And then over time, we can really roll that so that by the end of a 3-4 year cycle, we've encouraged all the departments to study those important programs, those highly effective programs against our results, and also look for those efficiencies. But it allows us to target it and allows us to direct the conversation and let departments know, here's where you need to focus your attention first.
I think as I've sat here and watched our strategic plan process develop over 2 years, we started out, the strategic plan is huge. It deals with big things, safe communities, happy, smiley people, things of that nature. And we've done some initiatives, but I do think we're at the point that something like this is the next logical step where we break down departments into the constituent programs. It is, you said it best, it is what do we do? The budget office did not a half-hearted attempt, but I think the effect of it was a couple of years ago. Some of your department heads remember we asked for you to break out programs. We're working ourselves to try to figure out what that meant to give us an inventory of programs. But then after that step, if you go through something like this, we cannot forget the measurement side of this. There's got to be, we put hundreds of millions of dollars. That's really what we do towards completing results that ultimately flow all the way back up to the strategic plan. I'm just starting to get the sense that there's a strategic plan, and there may be something like this a layer, and then ultimately there is studying efficiency, putting actual cost to output, and I mean by every department. IT figures out what it does, says it, you do networking services, whatever that means, however you would describe it, and this is the cost of doing those services. Right now we sort of cost IT by personnel costs, how much they need for operating expenses, and that's all we see. We don't really know we don't cost what you do, and we don't cost it every year. And that would just be the last part of, I think, this puzzle that would make it all tie in together. You have a strategic plan, sort of prioritizing your services, and then costing that out so you can look at it, and then you would complete the circle with the budgeting process. It seems really interesting.
I think you're going to love we didn't spend a lot of time, we didn't spend any time on it in this brief presentation, but there is a step in the middle after we've helped the departments get to that right level of identifying the programs and services that they offer. And you're right, there is a right level. There's a level where they're really getting into the weeds. They've identified things that are really more task-oriented. And then there's a level where there's still too high of a level, and we can break it down further. And you're right, when you start to talk about the network administration or help desk, or what it means to provide security for the infrastructure or the firewall. What does that really cost us to provide? And we have a step in the middle of this process where it's literally that. How do we generate a program cost so that we know what we're putting into that program, and here we're understanding what does that program actually achieve for us by way of results and those basic program attributes. The costing effort itself is fascinating enough. When we did this work in Cincinnati, Ohio, many on the city council said, we don't even have to get to the end. We have a program inventory. We know what we do for the very first time, and we know how much these programs cost. That alone is such a huge piece of information for us to incorporate into our decision making that we've never had before. That's eye-opening to John and I, and then to take it this final step to tie it then to the work that you've done in your strategic plan and those results. So we have that global perspective. How relevant are the things that we offer? Where can we focus on efficiencies? Where can we get into questions of shared services? Which programs should we have the discussion about internal policy review? It all connects. It all comes together.
Chris, John, this is Cora. I'm with the HR team, and one of the challenges that we have lots of times when we're trying to value ourselves, if you will, is that a lot of our stuff is compliance related, which means our savings is if we don't get caught doing something, so to speak. So what's been your experience of how in an organization like this would be able to determine the relative value, if you will?
I think one of the things that we see, so, we'll talk about maybe in HR where there are, or in an organization where there is some component of health services that are offered. We've got HIPAA compliance, or we might have COBRA compliance. As we look through that, we have to first identify where does that occur. Is there a program in which we are devoting resources to the compliance issue? So we'd want to articulate that, yes, we do devote resources to those compliance areas. That's where using both the concepts of the attributes. So for example, if it's a compliance issue, most likely it is because it's mandated by some other form of government. It is also most likely something that only we can do. It's not something that a private business offers. They may be totally dependent on the organization to do it. And then as you look at the governance results, we talk about the fact that it is important in terms of our risk mitigation, that we're doing regulatory compliance. There is a part of that that is about the protection and the management and optimization of our resources. There is, in many cases, whether it's COBRA or HIPAA, it could have to do with making sure that we're dealing with a good workforce. And so it's being able to articulate that there are things that we do, resources dedicated to what we call compliance, but they're related to many, many different reasons that those internal functions are there. And so we tend to see overall that when we can articulate a portion of what we do in our internally focused areas have to do with regulatory compliance, things that we have to monitor to be sure we're staying out of trouble, the way we define the governance results and some of those attributes normally contribute that those come out to be a relatively high priority for those governance functions, especially when it's something that the organization has articulated as a reason for which we offer internal programs. We usually try to focus most of the regulatory compliance areas in our governance functions. That's where the majority of those happen. Sometimes they happen in the other departments, but for the most part, finance, purchasing, HR, even IT, facilities, and fleet have a lot of things they do that are about compliance. And our experience has been, in most cases, based on the way they've been defined in terms of the results that we want those areas to accomplish, those programs have demonstrated a high degree of relevance. Now, one of the other things that this tool will demonstrate is it will help us focus on what are we spending on compliance? How are we devoting our governance resources? And the question may come up, maybe we're not spending enough of our resources on compliance issues because we're assuming a little higher risk than we need to. So it also helps us focus on maybe there are some of these results that we're spending a lot of money on, and maybe there are some of these results that we can see by the distribution in the model we might need to put more resources because we're not showing we're not accomplishing everything. And this is where the performance measures come in, because we're going to be able to see where are we failing, where should we be spending the money, and it may lead us to some conversations about results that aren't being attacked, aren't being focused on with sufficient resources. So not only does it point out we're doing a good job in some areas, it may help us focus on the areas where we're not doing as good a job as we should, and this helps lead that conversation with elected officials and policymakers, because they can see the disparity between the money we're spending on one result and the money we're spending on another result, and if they see them as equally important, it helps us determine we may need to look at beefing up what we spend on one of the results that's lagging in terms of the way we're allocating resources towards its success.
Any other questions from our implementation team or our budget staff?
I've got one last question. This public-private partnership, any uptake on that? I mean, are people really doing that?
Yeah, this has been one of the best parts of the work. So I like where you're coming from with the question. Is anybody really doing that? Or this is kind of it's such a buzzword. It's out there. People feel like it has some merit, but how do you get to the right programs to talk about? We've heard from so many organizations that say, yeah, we understand the idea of a partnership. Here's the problem. We want to stay in control of various programs. We don't want to give up control to another agency when we care about that program. We just worked with the city of Cincinnati, and they're high on our minds because they've really taken this process and the tool and the information to heart. And you can imagine that's a big city. They had close to probably 800 programs or so, services when all was said and done. So think about that. We offer 800 services. Where do we even start this conversation about public-private partnerships? Through their work with the model, they can quickly distill down to what are the programs that appear to be offered by the private sector as well as us. And then furthermore, if it's a low priority program, they're having a different conversation to say, we're not necessarily sure we want to partner on these programs. They're low priority to us. Can we open up a dialogue about the private sector actually taking on some of these programs? Whereas in the high priority areas, they're saying we absolutely care about these. They're highly relevant to us, and the private sector is doing them. First, are we competing against the private sector? And then secondly, what does a partnership start to look like? So going from 800 programs to something more on the order of 17 that meet that particular criteria, now they have something manageable. Now they have something they can study. And if you talk to Leah Erickson, who's the finance budget director in the city of Cincinnati, to start with something unmanageable and huge and politically charged and narrow it down to a small group of programs that absolutely make sense for that discussion, that's where they're starting to make their breakthroughs.
From starting from scratch to the point where you actually have some information based on this priority-based budgeting, how long did it take most of the organizations to get there?
If they're starting with nothing in terms of results or strategic plans or anything, usually we find that those organizations need probably about 6 months from the time they begin those discussions about results to the time they're actually able to start training on this final resource allocation tool. If they've done a lot of work already in results and perhaps even in identification of program inventories, 5 months has usually been a comfortable margin. We usually encourage organizations that if you've got that 5-month window before you really are engaged in some serious budget discussions, that's probably the ideal time frame. That most organizations we encourage, once you've adopted a fiscal year budget, take a little break, get a little breather, and then pretty soon after that, within a month or so, start working on this process to implement so that you're ready to engage in these meaningful conversations as you're developing that subsequent year budget. Some organizations also feel like because of the other things that are on their plate, they may be implementing a new financial system or something like that. They'll phase it in and they'll work through a 2-year budget cycle where the first year they're focusing on making sure they have their results and their inventories, and those inventories are costed, and then they'll go through the evaluation process. But for most of our organizations, the 5 to 6 month window is usually a fairly manageable time frame to get the work done, especially when they've done a level of work on strategic goals already.
Any other questions from this group here? No? Okay. Well, John, Chris, we greatly appreciate y'all running through this model and way of thinking with us, and we will consult as a group and definitely be in touch.
That's wonderful. And again, as you're talking, if any questions come up, just let us know and we'll be glad to fill in any blanks that a short presentation like this might not have been able to address. We'll be happy to do that. We just always appreciate the opportunity, especially for organizations like yours that are down the path of understanding why it's so important to integrate the strategic plan into our resource allocation decisions. We're always so thrilled to share the stories and the process so that you have something to evaluate and to think about as you're looking towards your future and your budget development. So don't hesitate to give us a holler, and we'll be glad to fill in any blanks that you still might have.
We won't. Thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Everybody have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.